Welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.
Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of the Center of Everywhere. My name is Kelly Ash, Research Associate for the Center for Rural Policy and Development. Today I'm speaking with my colleague, Marnie Werner, who just published a new research report looking into rural childcare. In this interview, we speak about the current lack of availability of childcare slots in rural Minnesota, the challenges center-based care face in rural Minnesota, and some of the community-level solutions that has Marnie excited. So we just released, or you just published and wrote and did the research on the state of rural childcare here in Minnesota, and we're going to have a little conversation about that. And I think starting off, it was back in 2016 was the first time that you published and did research on rural Minnesota childcare. And I think it's okay. You're a little bit modest about it, but I think it's okay if we take credit for kind of breaking open that whole issue back in 2016. And I remember you telling me stories about how you were hearing about this on the ground, but nobody had put kind of all the numbers together and kind of raised the issue. And you were able to do that in 2016 and testify in the state legislature. And here we are in 2021, still having this conversation.
Right.
Obviously, with the added wrinkle of a pandemic coming through. But we're seeing a lot of conversation at the state legislature about childcare and even at the federal level now, too, about how we can help give either more subsidies or change policies to try and incentivize more childcare providers to enter into the market. And I guess, with the new report, Marnie, do you just want to give us a quick update? What's changed since 2016? What were some of the big highlights of things that you noticed that are different today than they were when you first did this research?
Is watching these two different licenses, how they have changed over the years. Centers have gradually become more numerous. There's been growth in centers and growth in their capacity statewide. If you look at the numbers statewide from 2000 to 2020. The other one, though, is the family child care, and that has basically been falling off a cliff since 2020. It was declining gradually from, I think about 2003 was probably when it peaked. And then it gradually declined until about 2010, 2011. Then it started dropping much faster. And then around 2016, that drop started to slow, but it was still dropping by like a capacity of 4,000, 5,000 spaces a year. And so that's really been the story. Centers have been growing. Family childcare has been dropping off. If you look at it, the numbers statewide, it looks like centers are growing and family childcare is just fading away as centers replace them. Where that comes off the wheels is when you divide it up between the Twin Cities Metro and Greater Minnesota. And what we see there is that centers have been growing at a rate that they've just about been able to replace the loss in family childcare. They come out at about 2,000 spaces short. So they've gained about 37,000 childcare slots in centers, while they lost a little over 40,000 slots in family childcare. So that's pretty much one for one. That's okay. But in Greater Minnesota, everywhere outside the metro area, centers only gained about 15,000 slots, but family childcare lost 35,000. So rural Minnesota has come up with a deficit of about 20,000 childcare slots. And this is in 20 years when the population, is growing. So it's not like there isn't a need for childcare. So let's just say since 2016, it has gone from bad to worse.
In your mind, what is the central issue as far as why family care centers have been declining? And then in a rural area, why haven't center care providers been able to pick up the slack?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes there. Well, there's multiple factors that play into all of this that makes it hard to kind of analyze it. But I think first and foremost, you have to recognize that childcare is a business. One of the things we talked about in the report is we have to decide if childcare is a business or if it's education. And when you get right down to it, if you're going to figure out what the problem is with the way we are presenting childcare currently, it is a business. It's a private business in the state. And so then you just look at the economics of it. And I'll go to center childcare first. Center childcare, to make that run successfully, you need a certain population density. You need a critical mass of not only children who can go to your center, but their parents who can actually afford to pay the rates you need to charge to cover your expenses. And so if you live in a place or you want to open a center or a family, you know, childcare business, in a place where you have enough families with enough kids and those families make enough money to be able to charge to pay what you need to charge, and you can maybe make a little profit, then you're good. You're in that sweet spot. If you're not in that area, say you're in a rural location where you don't have a lot of kids within a certain radius of your business, because let's face it, it's childcare. Providing childcare isn't like ordering something off of Amazon. It's not like, oh, I can buy that and it'll just show up on my doorstep. It doesn't matter where it came from. Childcare can only serve people within a certain radius. And we hear, still regularly, I hear about people driving 30, 40 miles to take their kid to their provider. And, and there is a limit that people are willing to drive. And so within that radius, you don't have enough children or you don't have enough parents with high enough incomes to be able to pay what you need to charge, then you don't have a viable business. It's like if you have a hardware store and there just aren't enough people interested in going to your hardware store, then you can't maintain your business. And that's the issue with our childcare shortage right now in rural areas. And that is why centers don't develop organically in rural areas with sparse population like they do in a densely populated urban area. And so that's how we develop childcare deserts. And there are childcare deserts in urban areas too, in the core of Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have a lot of families, a lot of kids, but those families don't necessarily have the income that where they can afford to pay the provider what they need. And so those businesses don't develop there either.
Marnie, wondering, so why is it that the center-based childcare providers typically have to charge a little bit more for their services? Is there just more overhead? What does that look like?
Sure, that's it exactly. Centers have two big expenses. One is their overhead, which involves, a building. You have to either buy or rent a building. So you have the mortgage payment or the rent payment. And then there are the utility costs, so you have that electric bill and that gas bill and the insurance you have to pay. And so there's all that overhead. And then centers generally have staff. And so really pretty much most of the center's expenses go to paying people. And they're not being paid, they're not highly paid workers. And so those expenses aren't even really as high as they could be or should be. And so there you have the overhead and the staff costs up front with the center. And so that's why you need that reliable source of income to be able to, to know that you're going to be able to cover those expenses as you go forward. And with family care, there is a lot less of that, of those upfront costs and those overhead costs. So you already live in a house that you're presumably can already afford to pay for. You have, sure, you're going to have a higher electric bill, higher gas bill, but it's not going to be that much more. Um, there is insurance costs, that's an issue with a lot of providers, but you don't have those huge overhead costs right up at the front like centers do. And also, you don't have staff. Family providers don't generally have another person working for them. They may have another person step in occasionally, like part-time, if you need to go someplace, but they don't have that regular staff payroll. And so in areas where, in rural areas where you have that sparse population where you can't generate that income that a center needs, you have a much better chance of generating the income that a family provider can operate on. And so that's why we find that when you separate out, when you look at the share that family providers make up of licenses and capacity in rural areas compared to the metro area, rural childcare has been much more dominated by family childcare up until recently. Now, with the drop off in the number of providers and capacity, that share has actually dropped from about 2/3 5 years ago to about half now. And so that's just another, indicator of how much family childcare is just disappearing from the landscape.
So we talked a little bit about the center-based care, and we talked a little bit about why family-based childcare providers is a good alternative for rural areas due to its lower overhead and ability to kind of make things work. But we're seeing a drop off in that. Has there been any indication from the research you've looked at? I know you did a survey a few years ago with childcare providers.
Right.
What are some of the reasons which we've seen a drop off of people not only leaving the market, but also a lack of people entering the market?
Right.
Provide this, right? Because there's two pieces to this. We have people
Yes.
leaving, but then we don't have enough coming into it. So what's your sense on that?
Well, and that is the big question of, it's fairly easy to figure out why people are leaving. It's basically you can't make money at it. We also have people leaving because people are retiring. You had a lot of people who started their childcare business maybe in the 80s, 90s, the baby boomers, and now they're in their 60s, and it's time to retire, and do something else. But like you say, you don't have those younger people coming in behind to fill in behind them. And that's what's going on in both the metro and rural area. I think that's why we see the consistent drop off in both places. And I think what that boils down to is that women simply have so many better paying options now than they used to, 30, 40 years ago. The career landscape is just open to women now much more than the way they used to be. And if you're looking for a career that is going to pay you something, center-based childcare in a rural area may not be it, because it's very hard to generate money. And if, even if you want to go into early childhood education, there are teaching jobs to go into or other areas, or you move to the city and go and work for one of the larger centers where you have a good chance of getting health insurance, and things like that. And so childcare, as much as it's, desperately needed, is not an attractive career to young women. And so it's reasonable choice on their part. And I say women because, really it is almost exclusively women. The last time I checked, which was a couple of years ago, childcare was basically 98% women. And so it's safe to say, it's a choice for women. And, Yeah, and there are just a lot more options nowadays.
What has you excited? Because everybody wants to talk about solutions now. How are we going
Mhm.
to solve this issue? What has you excited looking forward?
Yeah.
Things that you're hearing out on the ground, a couple things that you think the state should maybe look at or regions could be looking at to do in their areas.
Well, first of all, I want to go back and address the thing about the centers and the quality education. And hopefully, I won't get myself in trouble. But yeah, I mean, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that this, childcare can't just be, it's not storage. When we were on our webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago for childcare, someone brought up a question that they had an employer in their town ask them and they said, "Why do we have to have this emphasis on education? Why can't it just be, just taking care of the kids and everything?" And you know, education is for little people under 5 years old is different from just putting them in classrooms. Everything a kid does from birth to basically 5 is education for them. They are wiring their brains so quickly. It's just amazing when you start looking into the research on the neurology of little kids and everything. And so you have to have that good environment that helps these little kids develop their brains. And when we're talking about education, we're not just talking about book smarts, like how to add. It's like teaching them how to interact with other kids and how to, not hit the kid who just took your toy away from them, to learn how to handle that properly and how to show up on time and think about other people instead of just themselves and think it's development. And so we do need to have quality childcare because we have to think about it as we aren't raising good children, we're raising good adults. We have to remember that these aren't just little kids just sitting there. These are people who are adults in training. And if you consider that we're not raising them properly or raising them constructively, just think 20 years in the future. What are things going to look like then when these kids are running the show? So yeah, we need that quality education. I think what has maybe been lost in the discussion on quality education, however, is the practicality of how to roll it out and how to actually implement it. And so this emphasis on that it can only be done in centers, I think, has been a real problem for rural areas. Not, I don't think as much as it used to be, but it is. It has been a problem because it has, I think, led to a certain amount of neglect of family providers, and not just in Minnesota, because a lot of the state regulations regarding childcare actually come down from the federal level. But yeah, I think it's thinking how things should be, I'll put that in quotes, as opposed to how does this actually play out and how can it actually be implemented. And when you're in an environment where it's already difficult to establish a center or a family provider, if it's hard to get a family provider business going, it's going to be a lot harder to get a center business going. And to ignore that fact when you want to implement these kind of standards is going to create problems. And so I think that is, one thing that really has to be kept in mind when we're talking about improving, raising childcare standards, and just watching out for these unintended consequences that are going to be creating problems. Now, what does have me excited? Number one, this is going to sound really weird, but when I looked at how many family childcare spaces we lost in 2020, because you think, oh, the pandemic, it did so much damage to childcare. And it did in other states. One thing I've heard but haven't verified is that during the pandemic, Iowa lost half of its childcare capacity. Well, so Minnesota came out much better, and it's, I'm sure, due to those emergency grants, from the state. I think they were a real lifeline for providers. We did lose spaces. We lost 5,000 family provider spaces in 2020. But when you look back, that's actually the smallest number of family childcare spaces we've lost in the last 10 years. So 4,000 is actually good. We're actually we're actually improving, Between 2011 and 2016, we were annually losing 5,000, 6,000, almost 7,000 spaces in 1 year. And then after 2016, it went back up to like, okay, now we're only losing 4,500 spaces, 4,200 spaces. And last year it was 4,000. So that's an improvement. We're doing something, I think, that's going in the right direction. Either that or we've lost so many family providers that the numbers are just dropping because the overall numbers are dropping. So
I think,
yeah.
there's been a lot of, obviously the state government put out those emergency grants, which I think made a big difference. But we've also had a lot of other nonprofits, philanthropy organizations kind of play a role too. A lot of the initiative foundations have been giving out grants too. I wonder too if that's making a difference, and just kind of, I feel like we've shined a pretty bright spotlight as a state on this topic, and maybe that's helping.
And I think that's what's going on too. I think the initiative foundations have certainly been doing, yeoman's work in just addressing the on the ground issues of things like helping connect rural providers with training. That's a big problem for, when your training is, 50 miles away and you have to take the day off, to go and get your required training. So that, and the grants they've been giving out, and just all that kind of on the ground kind of stuff that they're so good at. They've been doing a great job there. Other nonprofits have been doing similar things, and a lot of communities have just been making it a community issue and are bringing in, all the stakeholders, from the parents to the providers to the schools to the employers to the local government, to talk about what are we going to do about this. And then when people start putting their heads together, they start coming up with ideas. And I firmly believe that the practical solutions do have to come from on the ground, because every community is different. And the state's role in that is to set the overall regulations of safety and education, but let the local people figure out what's going to work in their town. But I think it is exciting how communities are getting together and figuring these things out, because when they start talking to each other, that's when they start discovering that, hey, we at the hospital, we do CPR training every month. We'll give it to providers for free, so they don't have to travel 100 miles to go and pay whatever to go and get their CPR training. So that's what's going on in one community. The other thing that really has me excited is what's going on in north central Minnesota. The state has a network of what's called service cooperatives that help local government and school districts with things like technology and insurance purchasing and things like that. And they work on a regional basis. Up in Region 5, the service cooperative there, Sourcewell, was approached by the human services directors from the 5 counties that they serve. Those directors were talking to each other about, could we possibly combine our part-time hours that we have devoted to county family child care licensing, which is the inspections and those things that the counties are responsible for. Could we combine those to somehow, pool our resources, and do a better job of it? Well, they ended up going to Sourcewell and bringing them in on the conversation. And the upshot is that the counties and Sourcewell, working with the Department of Human Services, developed a partnership where now Sourcewell actually provides the county licensing services. They do the onboarding and helping the providers, with finding resources, and they're like the one-stop shop for information. And then they even do things like they have an annual conference for family providers so they can all talk to each other, which is huge, because one issue with childcare is, for a lot of things in rural areas, is just the isolation. And so those counties have been extremely happy with it. The providers I've talked to who live in those counties are really happy with it. And 3 more counties have even come on board with Sourcewell now. And I think that's a really big opportunity to explore, to see if the other service co-ops or some other type of purchasing agreement or organization could be created to provide these kind of services that the counties frankly don't have the resources to provide as well as it needs to be.
One of the other things too, I've been hearing a lot of conversation about it. It seemed like originally maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when a lot of these rules and regulations came through, there's always been a clear separation of what family care looked like and what center care looked like. And family care was in a home, it was its own person, you drop your kids off. But as communities were having conversations about childcare, it came up, it seemed like that a lot of the family-based care were like, we would love to not have to have our business in our home. Is there a way we could all pool together and be in a space, but we're our own businesses, but we're all in the same space, maybe in downtown or whatever. And I think at the time that wasn't really allowed due to licensing reasons, but I know over the past few years that's changed. And so now there's the whole kind of pod idea.
Yes, the pod model.
Yeah. Well, so what is
Yeah.
that, and how might that work?
I think the pod model is brilliant. Yeah, so if you want to run a childcare business outside of your home, you previously had to do a center. You had to have a center license, and you had to have you had to have enough kids to be able to support the cost of opening a center. And if you had that many kids, you needed a staff person to help you with the state quotas on how many, the child per adult ratios and things like that. And it just got to be a lot of cost. And especially in rural areas, you weren't enough families to provide that critical mass, or the provider just wasn't interested in looking after a lot of kids. But at the same time, maybe they didn't want to have it in their home either, because that can be a lot of wear and tear on their house. And so the pod model came along, and the legislature actually approved it. So that was great. And what it does is it allows a provider to have their childcare business outside of their home in another building. And also other family providers under that kind of license could also operate in that same building. They have to operate their businesses separately. So they're not like pooling, the kids aren't all intermingling or anything like that. But they can share the costs of overhead then. So they're sharing the cost of the rent and the utilities and things like that. And so that can be a big cost saving for people. And I would think just another option for people where, maybe this was a major deterrent. Well, we've solved that, and so I think the pod model is great.
One interesting issue that we always see in small towns is almost always seems that we have 1 or 2 buildings empty in our downtowns.
Yes.
In our small communities. I'm a city council member in New London, and we have a similar situation where we have a couple buildings open right now. Have you heard of models where the city might be owning the building and rent it out to childcare providers? Is that something being discussed or not?
Yeah, it's definitely being discussed. And I know that there are cities that have been looking at doing that. The one place where I know they did try it, it didn't work out well, but I don't think it was because of anything to do with, the fact that they were using a building downtown. There were other reasons for it not working out. But I think that is something that a lot of small communities with these buildings, on their main streets would really like to do. And so the issue there then is getting the building up to the standards that are required for childcare. And in that case, some of those buildings are pretty old, and they need a lot of work and everything. I think there is a real opportunity, especially when you think about in these towns where they're having a lot of trouble just getting a construction company to come in and build some homes for people. Are they going to be able to get a construction company to come in and build a brand new center for them? And is there anybody in town who's going to want to have to pay for that then? Run their center, and provide the costs and everything. But when you have these buildings that are sitting there and they just need, remodeling, that's quite an opportunity. And then if you can apply that pod model, then you have a real chance to, turn that into something and use some already existing space for a good cause.
So, how about, have there been any ideas on the one side of trying to incentivize more people to enter into the provider market?
I can't think of anything at a more formal level. I might just be forgetting something, but I can't think of anything, like on a state level, incentivizing people to get into it. But I do know on the community level, there are, in some of these community discussions, they are talking about things like, we'll provide the building, if you want to run the center, and things like that, which is, good incentive. I think there are incentives that, it wouldn't be quite the same as, say, incentivizing a doctor to come out and practice in rural areas, where you offer student loan forgiveness and things like that. I think one of the big keys to incentivizing people for childcare is to just make it so they can make money at it. And I think a big key to that is the reimbursement rates. That was a big issue for providers, and I don't think anybody who wasn't a provider understood how big of a problem this was. Reimbursement rates refers to the Child Care Assistance Program that the state does, and that's money that comes down from the federal government, and Minnesota kicks in a share of that money too. And these are subsidies for low-income families so they can afford childcare, the childcare in their area. And a lot of providers, especially in rural areas where incomes do, tend to be lower on average, really rely on these reimbursement rates for their revenue. If they didn't have this, they would have a lot of families who just weren't using childcare or weren't using formal licensed childcare. They would be using the casual childcare. And so with the reimbursement rates, that money is assigned to the family, but it's a direct payment to the provider. And so that what created a really big problem and may contribute to this decline in providers was the fact that reimbursement rates were essentially frozen and even declined between 2006 and 2020 in Minnesota. So basically, it was like being told you're not going to get a raise for 14 years. And, and in the metro area, that's not quite such a big deal, because if you're one of those, centers in a sweet spot in the metro area, you can just say, well, I'm not going to take families that use CCAP anymore. I'm just going to, take families that pay cash on the barrelhead. In rural areas, you don't have that option, really, because if you don't take them, you may not have enough families, but on the other hand, your revenue isn't increasing. Now, providers can charge above the reimbursement rate, at which point the family is then responsible for the difference, but sometimes families can't afford it, and the providers, know that, and, being the kind, soft-hearted people they are, they don't pursue the families for this difference. And sometimes those families just won't pay the difference either. There's that issue too. And so the providers can be really just stuck with the reimbursement rate determining how much money they can make. And so I think this, now in 2020, the state really did take a good look at reimbursement rates and what was going on. And I think decided to take it seriously and fix it. And so they did raise the rates substantially in 2020, and they have earmarked amounts for it going forward into 22 and 23. And I think if anything at this point, can incentivize providers entering the business, maybe in kind of a passive way, is just making sure that those reimbursement rates, stay realistic and follow what it costs providers to provide childcare, so that a provider going into it in a rural area can be fairly confident that they are going to have that stream of income.
Well, thanks, Marnie, for your time.
You've been listening to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere, it is in the center of everywhere.